Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for WECC's Reliability in the West discussion series. We'll take another moment here and let people sign on real quickly. Today, we'll be talking about doing a status updates about large loads. We've been discussing large loads for the last couple of discussions here at the Reliability in the West. Today is March 5th. I'm Travis English. I'm WECC's Senior Training Outreach Specialist. Welcome to the discussion. We'll start things off with our antitrust policy. All WECC meetings are conducted in accordance with the WECC antitrust policy and the NERC antitrust compliance guidelines. All participants must comply with the policy and guidelines. This meeting is public, confidential, or proprietary information should not be discussed in the open session. This webinar is also being recorded and it will be posted publicly. By participating, you give your consent for your name, voice, image, and likeness to be included in that recording. WECC strives to ensure all the information presented today is accurate and reflects the views of WECC. However, all interpretations and positions are subject to change. If you have questions, please contact our legal counsel. With that, I would like to introduce today's panelists. We've got Julia Matevosyan. She's the Chief Engineer at Energy Systems Integration Group, or ESIG. Happy to have you on today. And then we've got Katie Rogers. She is WECC's Manager of Reliability Assessments. So thank you again for joining us. I'm going to introduce today's moderator, will be Victoria Ravenscroft. She is the Manager of External Affairs and Strategy here at WECC. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Victoria.
Great, thank you so much. Julia and Katie, thank you for joining us. Just a quick preamble. As Travis mentioned, we've talked about large loads before on this discussion series, and we know that there are a lot of conversations about large load happening all over the place, in corners and in boardrooms and such. And in the past, we talked about the high-level potential impacts. We heard perspectives from the large loads themselves. And we've heard from a commissioner out of Maryland talking about the experience they've had with integrating large loads. And that was in 2024. And then a month ago, we talked more about where the rubber hits the road and some of the potential operational impacts of large loads on the system. And so today we're going to focus in a little bit of a different vein, because despite all the conversation that's going on around large loads, this is still, for the West at least, very much an emerging issue. And we want to take some time to build some context around where we are. That's that status check that Travis was talking about. Where are we with regard to the large load issue? And as we move forward into this emerging risk, what are some of the avenues that we are going to be going down or need to go down to start to address it? So before we get to that, I wanted to build a little bit of context. And so my first question here, Katie, I'm going to start with you. WECC recently released a report on large loads that we did in partnership with Elevate Energy. And that report was really an exploratory endeavor into the large loads issue. And it laid out a fair amount of context for this. Could you share with us a little bit of the information in there, just to give folks an idea of how big, where are these loads, what's kind of going on here?
Yeah, so based on the research that was done with our partnership with Elevate Energy, we're expecting 35 gigawatts of new load by 2030. And for context, that is three times the size of LA's generation capacity. As far as the Western interconnection, we just released our WARA a couple months ago, or our Western Assessment of Resource Adequacy. And back in 2022, demand for electricity was expected to grow at a rate of about 9.5% over the next 10 years. And in our most recent data gathering, that has more than doubled to over 20% growth over the next 10 years, which is just crazy.
That's a huge increase.
Yeah.
So Julia, you have a different perspective because you're at ESIG, and obviously we are focused on the West out here at WECC and in the West. But we recognize that this isn't the first time anyone's ever dealt with a large load issue. Can you give us a perspective from the broader continent in what you're seeing and put this into context for some of our listeners that way?
Yeah, sure. I mean, other areas are also experiencing large load growth, and I can bring up example from ERCOT. In the past few years, they have installed, now it's 6 GW of large loads energized. But then if you look at the interconnection queue or everything that they are tracking, it's up to 70 GW by 2028, if I remember correctly. 70, yes, and 85 gigawatt peaking system, just to bring it into perspective. So potentially it's really big impact. Of course, not all of these projects are going to materialize. If you compare with the generation interconnection queue, about a third of projects normally materializes, but even if you take a third of this amount, it's still huge impact on the grid. Internationally too, I would say Ireland has the most experience, I think, with large loads today, where they have seen large growth from 2015 till 2022. I believe they grew about 400% of the large loads, and now really having to address modeling and reliability impact issues, and they had to put stop on development in certain areas just until they figure out how to connect them reliably. So yeah, definitely others are seeing this growth coming up.
So that leads a little bit into my next thought. And I just want to call it out there because there are conversations happening everywhere about large loads. Some are more informed than others, some are more fearful than others, but there are some conversations about the fact that, or the idea that large loads aren't that big a deal. Some people aren't hearing about it in the press. And so I think it's a fair question to ask. Okay, we have large loads on the system. Why are these such a big deal? Are they such a big deal? Are we making more out of this than we need to? And if we aren't, why? Why aren't they such a big deal? Or why are they such a big deal?
Can I start on this?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. We had historically large loads and refineries, manufacturing, mining type of loads, arc furnaces. Those are the technologies over time are more predictable and more understood. We had time to figure them out as they were connecting to the grid. It was kind of just one by one, and we dealt with impacts of each separately. And over time, we developed necessary standards or performance requirements as we needed them. We had sufficient time to plan and design power system around these characteristics. But these new types of loads, I guess, as everything nowadays, are coming at much faster pace. And so these are like data centers, crypto mining, maybe hydrogen loads to lesser extent. The data center takes 2 to 3 years to develop, and we haven't had time to understand, to gain experience with them, and to understand the grid impacts. There are no requirements for data or for models that we might need for impact studies, for transmission planning studies. There is no developed interconnection process to get this data, and we don't have good understanding of their profiles and dynamic performance to even develop performance requirements. And then the size of these loads is, it can be very large. So we are talking about up to 1 gigawatt projects even. They often get sited in a relatively close proximity, electric proximity to each other because of some kind of siting preferences, because maybe high-speed internet, maybe land availability that drives them all into one location or relatively close location. And that may create common mode failures relatively easily if we don't have performance requirements. So it can create tripping of multiple loads at the same time, and we are starting to see this already now. So this is kind of why it is bigger deal now than it used to be in the past.
If I can kind of add on, Julia, I love everything you said. And I think another thing that we observed in our research too is, well, one, there's no definition for large load. It's still kind of a concept, right? And so it depends who you ask, but in some cases too, maybe a single facility isn't an issue or concern. But when you start aggregating the sheer quantity of ones that we have, and then when you add data centers with other loads that we have been talking about, like electrification, and then they start getting added on top of each other, and things like electrification could also shift load profiles. So we may be, even looking at load profiles that we haven't historically seen or planned to. And so, I think the question of, is this a big deal? I feel like that's where we are, is trying to answer that question of, is it a big deal? We certainly see it has the potential to be a big deal. Now, as far as how it may actually play out in the end, we probably still have yet to see, but we definitely see a big possible risk here as all of these things come on together faster, bigger, bigger in terms of number of quantity, amount of megawatts that they're going to require to be consumed. And yeah, I'll stop rambling, but
Well,
a
it
lot
sounds
to
like
it.
this is a fairly complicated issue. It's not just that we have big loads and so we need more generation. It's not that it's not that simple. There's a lot more to it. There's the pace that you mentioned. There's interconnection issues. So maybe complication in itself is a part of this potential issue. This emerging risk, I guess, is the best way we could refer to it. Katie, you mentioned kind of where we are. Would you talk a little bit more specifically about where WECC is? And then I'd like to hear from Julia in terms of how does that fit into the larger context of where the rest of the continent and possibly the world are in terms of dealing with large loads. Where are we right now?
Yeah, so I would say a WEC, we are still very much in the asking questions stage, and I think we have more questions than we have answers, and maybe we develop new questions every day, so that list is ever growing. But we're really trying to gather information, right? So how big is this going to be? What are the potential impacts, and where can WEC plug in? How can we, speak into what's going on and provide support or provide help in whatever form that looks like? So I'd say we're still very much in that early stage where we haven't yet, determined what the solutions are and how to implement them. Hopefully we'll get there. We're planning to get there, but I would say that's not where we are today, unfortunately.
And do you think that we have a grasp yet on the potential impacts, at least conceptually, or are we still kind of learning about what those potential impacts may look like?
I think we're still learning about them. I mean, Julia mentioned how interconnection queues, we can get information from RBAs as to what their interconnection queues look like. But as Julia, I think you said that about 30% of interconnection queues actually come to fruition. But again, that's an approximation, right? And it could be more, it could be less. And so we're starting with the data we have, and there's still lots more that we need to be able to put, the whole picture together of what that possible future is going to look like.
Yeah, and on that data, before I turn it over, I was just thinking, that 30%, even if 30% of that 70 gigawatts materializes in Texas, that is still a substantial increase in large load in that region. So that note is taken. That I know that there's a lot more in the interconnection queue, and yet that's a big number, and that could be a big number in the West as well. So, Julia, where are we, from your perspective, in terms of grappling with learning about this emerging risk?
Yeah, I agree with Katie. Everybody is still learning. I think some areas, I mean, they already facing large loads, so they are having to connect them the way, current processes and models fit. They still, on the other hand, evaluating what's the impact of doing it that way. While at the same time, I think like ERCOT, maybe in Virginia, they're seeing also large load growth. They're figuring out kind of smaller, lower hanging fruit steps in the interconnection process that help them to inform modeling, inform studies, inform understanding of impacts. And so, for example, one of the, I think, first steps is forecasting, right? How do we understand which projects are going to materialize? And that feeds into a lot of planning processes. So that's resource adequacy assessment. Do you have enough generation to feed that load? Do you have enough transmission? How do you look at, generation impacts? On the load impact, sorry. And so from that perspective, you would want to know which of these projects are more likely to materialize and where. And so I think like the lower hanging fruit here is to develop milestones that help to get certainty in the projects. And I know in some areas they're looking for financial commitments. PJM, for example, they came up with these financial commitments that provide certainty to the interconnection process. So these milestones that give more, so maybe site control evidence, some of the steps that will tell us that this load is more certain, but then also taking it from the transmission owner to the transmission operator, transmission planner. This information may just stay with transmission owner, and then transmission planner, when doing their planning exercise, they don't know if this load is coming, and therefore they cannot plan transmission accordingly. So this, I think this is the first step to get kind of milestones of understanding certainty of the projects going forward. And then from that on, there are other steps in the interconnection process that can provide more details into modeling and studies and reliability impacts.
So I want to ask a question about modeling. Before I do, I want to just remind our audience to put your questions for our panelists in the chat. And we have folks behind the scenes who are receiving those questions, and we'll pass those through. We don't take questions live, so in the chat. But I want to dig into the modeling and really more around our how prepared are we to do the type of analysis and gain the understanding that we need to move forward in either determining that this is not a risk, to be fair to those folks who think that might be the case, or figuring out that this is a risk and then addressing it. What's the state of our modeling, and given great forecasting information, which is always on the list, are we prepared? Do we have what we need?
I don't think we. I mean, there are different kinds of modeling. Maybe worthwhile just separating. There is modeling for transmission planning, kind of steady state, long-term transmission planning. There is modeling for resource adequacy assessment, for market design, maybe for introducing load participation models in the market. So there are different types of modeling. And then there is modeling for reliability assessment. I think I want to focus on the latter, but just for the former, even there, I think there is this uncertainty piece that we need to understand, and also flexibility piece of how these loads can be varied over time, how price sensitive they are. So all of that feeds into this, resource adequacy, transmission planning type of assessment and modeling. But then on the reliability side, I think it's even more complex because load models overall, even historically, is not an easy topic. It's still, area of ongoing research over the years, as long as we had power systems. And this is because there is less regulatory oversight of the loads, and loads historically have been smaller and more dispersed. So it's also more difficult to model. They represent a variety of different technologies. So even before large loads, load modeling was a kind of complicated topic. Just to bring it into perspective, in the past 10 years, it took 10 years to develop single phase air conditioning model, because these are, just residential air conditioning that in aggregate can have impact on reliability of the grid after certain contingencies. And so researchers spent 10 years developing that model. And now we have, these large loads coming up, and we have less certainty about this load models. We don't have meaningful insight into the load structure. We don't quite yet understand the level of details that is important for different types of studies. So, how much into the weeds we need to go modeling each load separately. I don't think we yet understand all different types of large load models that we need. Another thing is simulation tools today don't have these models available to the point where we can, pick ready-to-use model, parameterize it to represent certain large load in a certain area, and just run a study. So then you're stuck with using this available model, but you have to parameterize it somehow to represent this large load that you want to look at, at this impact that it might have on the grid. And we have very little data to inform this parameterization. So we don't have data to populate even this existing models. So as a first step, I was kind of thinking about, what can be done as a lower hanging fruit. I think the most crucial step here is to understand this large loads performance during disturbances. So like the write-through capability for voltage disturbances, for frequency disturbances, the fast ramping behavior, so second to second type of ramping, and the maybe minute-to-minute operational profile to the lesser extent. But if we understand at least these characteristics, then maybe we can come up with some proxy models as a minimum, and then for some extreme, contingencies for disturbances, we can look at the impacts on the grid. But then, in the longer term, we need more detailed models. We need to understand how they interact with other loads and interact with inverter-based resources, because to mention this, all these data center loads are power electronic type of loads and may interact with each other and with other devices on the grid.
Well, you made an important point, and I want to underscore that point for our audience, that we need to understand how these operate and the impact they may have on the system when all is well. We also need to understand what impact they might have on the system when all is not well, either with them or with the system itself. And so we're looking at two different kinds of situations. Katie, given this, and given that in WECC's Western Assessment of Resource Adequacy last year, large loads came in prominently in the findings. Where are we in the West, and WECC in particular, in terms of being able to get our arms around this from an analytical perspective? Where are our models right now?
I think Julia nailed it all. A lot of the models just don't exist yet. So, and like you said, we may not even have sufficient information to build the models because we don't know how they're going to behave in good or bad situations. And so it's hard to build the model if you don't know the operating characteristics, if you don't know that its ramping capabilities or the anticipated behavior during certain circumstances. So I think we're all in the same boat there of trying to get that information so that we can start building those accurate models that then can be deployed in a myriad of ways to ask a lot of different questions and hopefully get answers. But we're still at that early stage of we need to understand the behavior to really build the appropriate models.
Katie, where does that start? Does that start with the entities with the models going and getting the data? Does it start with the entity with the large loads who are putting things on the system, approaching the entities with the model? Where do we start building, and have we started building improved models and data?
I can take a stab, and then Julia can tell me all the ways that I got it wrong. But I know, one of the areas that ESIG has definitely highlighted as an opportunity for gathering some of this data is part of the interconnection process. When somebody is trying to get something connected and has a new facility in there, what can we do to gather the data at that point? And does that provide opportunities, especially because I'm a firm believer in somebody's got to have some skin in the game to be able to want to play ball. And so when somebody is trying to get something built or interested in, that seems like a really good time to me to say, hey, then we need some more data from you. Because I think it's just hard to go out and cold call at, asking for information. So I think there's definitely an opportunity as part of that interconnection process to start gathering some of that information. I will now hand it over to Julia to either correct or add to.
Yeah, no, that's right, and it can be as little as I mentioned. What's your voltage write-through capability. And maybe you don't even need to go, what's the capability is, what are the protection settings that you set your data center to trip or switch over to backup generation when there is a voltage disturbance on the grid. And even understanding that, you can come up with a very simple model, but it's still informative for when transmission planner runs the dynamic study for faults. They can have just this model trip as soon as voltage is at this level, right? And at least that already tells them, okay, this load will trip and this will have certain impact on the grid. And is it possible for the grid to take it? What needs to be done from the grid side to mitigate the impact? So that's kind of a starting point. And then at the same time, there is no way around it, right? We cannot put a stop on this. This is just economic development, and it's a progress. We cannot just stop developing large loads. So they keep developing. At the same time, I think research organizations like EPRI has always been very active in both load and generation model development. I know they are already working on developing data center load model, kind of like a generic model that can be parameterized to represent then specific sites. So that work needs to happen anyway, and it will be happening, and hopefully in the future we can use these models and parameterize them, represent these loads more accurately. In the meantime, as I said, we're already connecting these loads. What could be really helpful is to have some kind of monitoring requirements, so that loads have monitoring equipment that can be used to inform the models later on once we have models to populate. And any kind of both generator model and load model requires real-time kind of disturbance data to inform how accurate the model is. And so having this data gathered early on will help us in the future to populate the models and see how accurate they are. And I don't think this requirement exists today, but that's something people need to think about and maybe develop the requirement to have monitoring equipment on sites.
So would it be fair to say, just to kind of summarize, what we're talking about here with the status of models, and historically, load has not been, it's been more of an input than it has been a variable that we kind of move around in our models. We typically move transmission and resource assumptions and those kind of conditions in our models. Are we adding some measure of variability to this? Meaning, is this becoming one of those levers that we have to start pulling in our models, because load seems to be, in a way, getting a mind of its own, and modeling its behavior is becoming more and more uncertain? Is that the frontier that we're staring out on right now, potentially, with this issue?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I see similarity with generation too, with inverter-based resources, specifically wind, solar, storage, right? So as we started integrating those in the grid, their main goal was just to produce megawatts. They were not providing services that synchronous fossil fuel generation historically provided. And we haven't thought about this. It was just, okay, they're small, they just injecting megawatts. And then over time, then you understand, okay, the impact on the grid becoming so large that the grid itself cannot provide all the services to mitigate the impact. So now this resources need to provide certain services, need to have certain capabilities. And I think this is what will happen with loads. So we are already connecting them now. We are not asking anything from them. We just, we hope we understand the impacts. We try to study the impacts as much as we can right now, but overall they're just, megawatt drain basically to the grid. But I think over time, because they're large and the impacts will be even, combined maybe between multiple large loads and things like that, I think over time there'll be, point in time when grids will not be able to provide all the services that these loads need. And at that point, we will start treating them as a resource, if you will, where they can also provide certain services to the grid, and they have to have certain capabilities to even get connected. And if the load itself cannot provide it, then maybe they need to bring additional devices or maybe generation on site that can provide the services to allow them to connect reliably, because otherwise it will kind of put stop to how much we can absorb in the grid. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, I really like the way you put that, Julia. I mean, it feels like, historically speaking, load was something we couldn't control and generation was something we could. And it seems like to some degree those are changing, at least how we've historically thought of them, right? When you talk about wind, you can't just turn it on and ramp it whenever you want. Um, and then when we talk about loads, right? Like even asking about demand response has become a big topic, and not just currently with large loads, but over the last number of years, because having that ability to, can we control loads, can we do something, or maybe they'll co-locate with generation facilities. There's still a lot of unknowns because it is kind of a new frontier for how loads maybe operate or impact the grid.
Right. I'm going to pause. I've got a couple audience questions popping in here, and I want to make sure I do some housekeeping on those. Just a point of clarification. Does the assumption of 30% of the interconnection queue coming online, does that get used in any of WEC's internal modeling? How do we use that assumption?
No, so currently that is not an assumption that's being used. I mean, I would say honestly, that's one of the questions we still have and how to improve our modeling. So no, that's not something that is an input currently. I can't say that it wouldn't be. Go ahead, Julia.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. So I use that 30% number. It's oftentimes, the numbers like this kind of rule of thumb gets picked up and used everywhere. So I wanted to, put a word of caution. I use this in conjunction with generation interconnection queue. So that's kind of
Fair.
The rate of generation interconnection queue that materializes in ERCOT historically, 25 to 30%. That's what you see, being built. And so just by analogy, if we apply same rate to loads, it's still a large number. That's what I meant. But I don't know if there are any studies that people have done looking at how many of loads materialize based on, what is in the queue. And that's maybe LBNL is doing really good research on looking at generation queues elsewhere, including ERCOT, but also elsewhere, to look at compared interconnection queue versus what materializes. And hopefully they'll have similar research about large loads in the future.
And I want to underscore that point for our audience, that not to take the 30% number as a hard number. I believe in the West it's actually a different number anyway. So and that is the generation interconnection queue. So, but by way of example, that even a portion of that amount. So thank you for making that point, because we don't want to send people away with numbers that get repeated and ultimately turn into fact somehow down the line, or truth, I suppose, down the line. One other question from the audience on WEC's current approach, and I would expand this question to the West's current approach, if I might, because WEC doesn't really have an approach to large load forecasting that we do in a vacuum. It depends on our entities. But Katie, what is that approach to large load forecasting, and is there a milestone? Is there a milestone projects? Oh, I see. I see. Is there a milestone that projects need to reach in order to be included in future load forecasting?
So from WEC's perspective, we don't make those decisions as far as what gets included. So currently, we take the forecasts that are given to us from the BA. So and we get data up through 10 years. Now in our last cycle of WEC assessments, we did expand into that 20-year time frame. I would not say that we came up with a concrete way of forecasting. I'd say we're dipping our toe in those waters. But primarily what we're doing right now is purely based on what the BAs give us, based on how they evaluate the likelihood, and to be fully transparent, there are questions about when is the right time. And it's not unique to large loads, let's be fair. Like transmission projects have the same, question of at what point in a project does it become pertinent to include it? Because we all know that things fall through, or something happens with permitting or money and something doesn't happen. So that just is a bigger question that I think we wrestle with of what's the timing for including these things, which just becomes a bigger question when what you're talking about is bigger numbers. And so that will probably continue to be a big focus of when is the right time to start including these projects, just because those numbers are so big and can sway the studies significantly one way or the other.
Julie, anything to add?
Victoria, if I may add, I've heard in a different forum, again, discussing large loads, that this is, there is an issue kind of with that the process where, transmission owner provides this forecast to, whoever is the transmission planner or higher level forecaster for larger area. And there is no transparency of how large load interconnection process on the transmission owner side feeds into the overall transmission owner forecast that they provide upwards to the larger area of, forecasting entity, if you will. And so it was flagged that it would be helpful if there is more connection between transmission owners, large load interconnection process and forecasting, and kind of transparency to the transmission operator or transmission planner of how this large load interconnection queue actually feeds into transmission owners' forecast, so that where it could be like tracked to specific projects, and people could understand milestones that that inform transmission owners' forecast overall.
So I have one more question from the audience before I change course a little bit here, and this has to do with a data request that WECC puts out every year called our Loads and Resources Data Request. And the question is that I'm gonna build onto this a bit, but WECC has their Loads and Resources survey or data request. Is that a tool that can be used to get more data on these large loads and the queues going forward? And I would expand that to say, do we have adequate data gathering tools, requests, surveys, or do we need to strike out in a different direction or consider a new kind of data future for ourselves in terms of how we share data? And are these old ways of getting data, are they too antiquated for what we're trying to accomplish?
That's a lot in one question. I'll start at the beginning. Yes, our Loads and Resources is definitely at least where we're starting with how to gather this data. What we have found, however, is it's not enough to say, oh, I'm going to ask a question about large loads, because we all know someone. I don't know. I'm reminded of Miss Congeniality when they say, "What's your perfect date?" and everyone says walking on the beach, and then she says April 12th, right? Like, a simple question could be interpreted different ways, or you end up with unexpected answers. So, this is new for us. And so we actually, in our last LNR data request, we did put in questions about large loads. We're just starting to go through that information and finding, oh, maybe our questions were not as robust as we thought when we put them together. But we'll keep learning and grow from that. We've always maintained that is not our only way of getting data. However, right now I would say it is one of our big or primary ways. So, the other thing I feel like we have to weigh is the burden of continuing to go back to the well and being aware and considerate of that too, that we want to make sure that there's lots of questions we could ask, but are we asking things that are really getting to the heart of what's needed and what the problem is? Are the answers really going to be valuable for us to do something with? So we want to make sure that we're really considering all of the components. Yes, we are asking questions. Yes, we can continue to get better in that realm, and we want to make sure that we don't ask for the world if that's not all that that's not what we need. That we're really targeted and specific about what we're asking for too. I hope that answered
Yeah, no,
most of the
that's
components.
helpful.
Okay.
And Julia, you mentioned earlier, an idea of monitoring devices that would provide information that in the future we could look back on and use to help determine how these large loads are behaving. Any other thoughts on how we improve the data that we're getting to make sure we're getting the data we need to even model the system?
Yeah, I think in the forefront of this, it would be really helpful to kind of develop more coherent process about how interconnection requests are getting in, right? What information is provided in the interconnection request, and then as the large load is progressing through the interconnection queue and studies, maybe at the time when interconnection agreement is signed, this is a good time to trickle that information upwards to forecasters, to whoever does resource adequacy assessment, transmission planning, all of that. But I feel like it should be one system where all this information gets in and gets processed by different entities, rather than, somebody is using transmission owners interconnection queue, somebody is using surveys, and we may double count certain things, or we may miss some other things. So it creates, there is no coherency between the kind of data flow. So that's one, and over time, we'll probably will be kind of asking for more information and more data as we learn what's important and what matters. So that process gets more populated. But then on the back end, that's what I was talking about. Monitoring data is, as this load resources are already being operational and deployed, it's a good source of information to understand how they behave, and it can be like even daily profiles that we can understand better from monitoring equipment, but also second to second and even sub-second behaviors that will inform models that we use for dynamic assessment, for example.
So it sounds like on the data front then, that what we're looking for is not just improvement or enhancement of our current data requesting processes and the current data that we need. We need to enhance our current data and get it from sources that we know about. But we're talking about adding different types of data and a whole new set of data submitters in these large loads going forward. And that's changing the game in terms of how we get data, when we get data, and the quality of the data that we get.
Yeah, and again, it's not probably not a desirable path for large load developers, and everybody kind of loads want to be treated as load, not as a resource. But because they are big and because of the impact, there is a lot to learn from generation interconnection process. I'm not saying that it has to be copied completely, and it's maybe too much to ask from loads, but it's somewhere in between of how we treated loads historically versus how we treat generation today. And somewhere in between, there is this ideal process of how we get sufficient information about large loads.
So if we take a little bit of a step back and just look at kind of reliability risks to the interconnection, right? We can talk about things like extreme weather events, and I would contrast those with something like a large loads, because on one hand, we do have past behavior to look at, and I think we all subscribe to the idea that hindsight is 2020, and we can learn from things that have already happened. And so in the realm of risks, there are some risks where we have seen and we have more information about what's needed or what questions we need to ask because we have some experience in that. And I think one of the maybe, I hate to say the word fears, but I'm going to, for lack of a better one, with large loads is just that we don't have a lot of prior experience to lean on. Or even if we had these facilities, right, they were not as large, they were not happening as frequently, they were not as widespread. And so it's a bit different. And so it's very different when you're looking into the unknown and you aren't going to ask all the right questions up front. And you are going to have to take some time to refine your process and go, oh, okay, well, I asked this question and that ended up not being helpful at all. And what I really should have asked is this, but you're not going to know that until you get into it to some degree. So we want to try to do the best we can to be ahead of it, ask what we can think of, but also fully recognize some of this we're going to just have to go through and figure out through the process what's needed to some degree. So hopefully there's a little bit of an understanding of that there's no way to have this perfect on the front end, even though we're going to do our best to, ask the right questions, gather the right information. There's probably still going to be ways that we're going to have to adjust as we keep going.
That's a great point, kind of taking us back to where we are with this issue, that this is an emerging risk. It's emerging very fast. And that's the tension, right? How do we explore the risk and ask those questions, some of which are going to be the wrong questions, and kind of run into a few corners? How do we do that in an environment where the pace of change is so much faster than what we've seen on the system in the past? And those are the big challenges, right, that we have as a system. It's why we all sign up to work in this industry, I think.
It's not boring. I mean, we can say that, right?
Yeah. So I want to shift gears a little bit, because as part of the study that WECC did, we had an advisory group, and on that advisory group, there was some discussion about the policy aspect of all of this. And my guess is we probably have folks in the audience who are going, well, who's letting all these large loads move onto the system? And this is part of economic development. Is it just the wild, wild west, so to speak? And they can just pop up anywhere. Who's minding the shop here? And there were some requests that or not requests, I guess I would say some thoughts that advisory group had about policy and things they were looking for that I thought were interesting and wanted to bring into this discussion, given our audience for this series. So Katie, would you mind just giving us some insight into what some of those thoughts were from the advisory group?
Yeah. So, a large load is complicated in that it may cause some risks to your system. And if you're doubling your, peak load in a small region and don't have the needed transmission or distribution to handle it, that's one question. But there's also is the economic question. And usually the economic side is very appealing to these locations, going, yes, I want to be able to facilitate having these facilities come and set up in my space, and we will benefit from that, and I like that. However, I think there's some feelings that it can be a race to the bottom to incentivize, or maybe not incentivize, that's probably not the right term, but without a standard set of rules and expectations, then it can feel like a race to the bottom. If I say no, or if I provide any pushback, or, say I want them to do this first, whatever that is, they're just going to go somewhere else. And I don't want to be the one to say no or to chase them away. And so there was a lot of interest in how can we have some base level of expectations so that no matter where they go, it's going to be the same, so that it isn't decentivizing them from setting up in the location purely because the expectations are higher, or whatever it is. So as far as what those standards are, what those expectations are, that would definitely yet to be seen. And again, I know that's an area that ESIG is really digging into in their large loads task force project teams as well. But there was a lot of interest and a lot of agreement in some sort of starting place where no one's being left behind. We're all starting from the same spot. Would be really helpful. Julia, do you have other thoughts on what you guys are hearing?
No, I think, Katie, I agree with you. Just maybe one thing to mention, again, kind of by analogy with generation interconnection, Katie, I think that's exactly what you alluded to. And one reason why this percentage of generation that materializes in ERCOT faster, or like at larger rate than in some other areas, is this question of assessing what it takes to connect large loads and how they are kind of processed through the interconnection queue. And I think this is a policy decision, and this is what creates, backlogs in some areas and maybe gets them connected faster in the others. And this will apply to loads as well. So kind of overall, there is a efficiency to be gained from planning the system as a whole, right? As a kind of integrated plan, where you assess generation that comes in together with the large loads that come in. You assess how much additional generation is needed from resource adequacy perspective. You assess how much transmission is needed from, transmission transmission needs perspective, and doing this coherently and together as in one integrated plan makes a lot of sense. I think my fear, in lack of better word, is that same approach will be applied to large loads interconnection as we historically had for generation interconnection, where we assess them one by one, we assign transmission costs to each. And it's not about, maybe they are less concerned about costs compared to, generation projects, but we want to build the system efficiently, and we want to, to invest just as much as needed. And from that perspective, assessing all loads that are coming in and all generation is coming in together and all transmission needs together is paramount to clear out backlogs on both sides. And then it can, question comes from cost allocation. Then we kind of come back to that and figure it out. Who is the causer and what's the cost and who should pay what. But I think coming from the end of like cost allocation and connecting projects one by one and assessing needs one by one, this will lead to inefficient process and overbuild of, transmission and resources.
Well, and I'll say,
and that
WECC
requires
even,
policy decision.
WECC this year even identified, I guess, not calendar year, but year as in rolling, I guess, identified one of our RRPs as lack of coordinated resource and transmission planning. And so outside of large loads, we already recognize exactly what you were saying, Julia, that this historic behavior of doing one at a time is not sufficient. And so I think you can just roll in these large loads into the same concept of holistic system planning. Absolutely.
So we have just a few minutes, and I want to ask the question about it when it comes to things like severe weather and other changes on the system. We kind of are the victim of our conditions, right? We can't change the weather, but this is different. There are human beings on the other side of this issue, if you will. And in the past, I know that the system, that large loads have worked with the system in terms of demand response. And so there must be an opportunity here to work with those. We heard from some folks last year on this discussion series. And Julia, I would start with you. Do any examples spring to mind, whether you have specific ones or not, of the large loads moving onto the system and working with the system rather than just kind of plopping down a data center and then letting the grid kind of deal with it? Is there a future where we're really cooperating here with the humans on the other side of this issue?
I think there needs to be a participation model before there is, I mean, nobody will come and say, oh, I want to develop large loads for the sake of doing, its process, but then, I will also provide the services to the grid because I understand it's important. I don't think that's what's going to happen. It's more from, system operators' point of view. They need to define what the system need for this type of resources, if you will, is, and how they can participate. Either it's in the market or it's an interconnection requirement. So similarly, how it was for for generation. There are markets for certain products what generators can offer, but there is also some of the things that maybe markets are not suitable for. I just wrapped in interconnection requirements. So same thing will need to happen for loads eventually. I feel like one of the good examples is not about large loads, but in ERCOT area, I believe since 1996, loads are providing primary frequency response. So this is very effective. So it's even, you can call it fast frequency response, effective way of reacting to large generation trips. Currently, I believe they are providing to 50% of this primary reserve that ERCOT carries. And so similarly, these large loads can provide this, but I understand like economically they're not motivated, money that they are making from the business are much more than what electricity market can offer through some kind of market products. So from my perspective, it's more from, system operator, transmission owner's point of view. They need to define what they need, and that becomes a condition of interconnection. So if you are providing this, you can interconnect. If you're not providing this, you cannot interconnect. Or maybe you can interconnect faster if you're providing these services. So there needs to be some kind of incentive that probably is not necessarily monetary incentive for them to bring the services to the grid. But I think capability is there, and a lot of things can be done on the load side. Even that fact that they can switch over to the backup generation, that means that at certain times they can provide fast frequency response for the grid, for example, if needed.
Okay. All right, last question. We'd like to give our panelists just an opportunity for one last thought, your parting message for our audience on the issue of large loads. And Julia, I'll start with you. What's your final thought?
So I think we need to bring somehow, I don't know, way, and ESIG large loads task force is one of the avenues that we are hoping we can bring large load developers to the table. I think, again, by analogy with early days of IBR development times, I think they are in the business of doing the data center stuff, and they are not necessarily aware or concerned about impacts it has on the grid. And so understanding is I just plug in and I have a reliable power. And so we need to have this conversation. We need to bring them to the table and understand what the capabilities of the facilities are. Where is the complete limit? Like I cannot go beyond this and I cannot provide this no matter what I do. And then the rest, the grid has to deliver. But we need to have this conversation kind of give or take. What are the capabilities? What are the limitations of large loads? Do a good job of explaining to them what's the impacts on reliability are and how it's going to affect them, at the end of the day. So that we know, we know what the impacts are, and we bring them to the table, and they work with us, with grid operators, with transmission planners, providing all this necessary information. And I think this is not happening today. If you go around the different working groups and task forces that are happening on large loads, it's primarily power systems engineers that are sitting there. They're not large load developers yet.
Great, thank you. Great points. Katie, last thoughts for the audience today.
Mine is probably very similar to Julia's, and just that nobody can tackle these alone, right? Like the utility, the BA, even WECC, being a big body looking interconnection wide, even we can't do it alone. And so I think Julia's point of bringing people from both the utility, transmission, generation side with the developers, we need their involvement. WECC is really plugging in with the work that ESIG is doing, and NERC, and I know ERCOT has a task force. And I think, the more people at the table, I think the easier time we'll have at really, I don't want to say solving the problem because that implies that it's a problem, but really coming up with a beneficial path forward for everyone who's involved. So that's my thought.
Great, thank you. New expanded conversations, new expanded data, and an emerging potential risk. for us to tackle. Thank you both so much for your candor and for answering the questions and the conversation today. I'm going to turn it back over to Travis, who has a couple parting announcements having to do with our next webinar and some more large loads conversation. So Travis, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, Victoria, thank you so much for leading that conversation. And to Julia and Katie, thank you. Appreciate you coming and discussing that with us today. Just a couple of housekeeping items. We did put a link to all of those, the Western Assessment of Resource Adequacy and that large load study in the chat, so you can access it there. We also shared a survey where we'd love to get your feedback on the discussion series. And I'd like to invite everyone to attend next week's technical session at our board of directors, where we'll be discussing large loads. And we'll be talking about what actions WECC and others in industry can take to address large loads. We'll have Katie will be back talking to our board of directors. ERCOT will be here, as well as some members from CERC as well. So that's Tuesday the 11th at 2:30 to 3:30 Mountain Time. And then mark your calendars for the next Reliability in the West discussion series, which will be happening April 2nd at 11 a.m. Mountain Time. And it's interesting that modeling and data really bubbled up to the top here, because that's what we'll be talking next time. We'll be talking about modeling and data gathering, and just invite you to join us then. And appreciate you taking the time and joining us this morning. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks again.